We're on number 6 of chapter 2, or excuse me, chapter 3, lesson 3, and we're told to find the following sums. Now, I've shown you several ways to do this, and I'm hoping that you will eventually develop your ability to add and subtract in your head, similar to the same way that you did when you learned how to count numbers with your fingers, as we said, because ultimately what happened? You ran out of fingers. You say, well, I can use my toes. Well, once you get beyond 20, if you have 5 fingers or toes on each hand or foot, you can only go as far as 20. Unless you got very creative and started using your ears and maybe your nose, I don't know, your teeth even. That would be a lot harder because you can't pull your teeth out, right? Certainly if you're not just because you're doing a math problem. So what you want to do is you want to understand the numbers and their values and where they lie in terms of, let's say, that number line. So let's take a look at the first one, 6 plus negative 6. Well, we know 6 plus negative 6, they're opposites. We have a positive 6, a negative 6, 0. Negative 2, positive 2, 0. Those are the easy ones. But now we have a negative 5 and a positive 12. Okay, so we have a negative 5 and a positive 12. Now, we can teach you math so many different ways. You can rewrite this and simply say 12 plus negative 5, and you could certainly say 12 minus 5. Okay, and we know 12 minus 5 is equal to 7. Okay, this is where we're going to ultimately head in terms of taking something like this and making it this way. You might say, well, why do that? Well, you're going to find out that it's a lot easier to add positives and negatives together than it is to subtract sometimes. And when I say add them, I'm saying adding a value of plus or minus. So here we have a minus 5 and we have a positive or a plus 12. So we have 2. Now, my first question is this going to be positive or negative? Being that the 12 is bigger, I would say it's going to be positive. Now we can do our number line. We can try to turn things around. We can just try to do this in our head. The answer here is positive 7 or just 7. We should be able to see that in terms of maybe a more visual aspect of, let's say you have a ruler, okay, of 12 inches, right? And then you're going to have a negative 12 here. Remember we had the antiparticle, this is the anti-ruler, okay? And this is the negative side. Or let's just say we're going to add a negative, meaning we're going to cut off. Well, if I took 5 inches off of a ruler, I would end up with 7 inches, right? This would be the 5 inches, though it looks almost even. Let's just pretend that this is slightly longer, but you see this is going to eliminate this portion of the ruler. This is taking it away, which leaves us with the 7, okay? So we were doing that with with particles in mind before. We're going to just need to be as creative as we can with our own thinking. How can we look at things? And if we look on to the next one, we have negative 11 plus negative 9. Now again, we have 2 negatives. When you add 2 negatives, you're adding negative onto negative, which means you're going to have more negative, which means I really just need to add these 2 numbers together, 11 and 9. When I add 11 and 9, I have 20, but remember they're both negative, so negative 11 plus negative 9 is going to be really negative, and that would be negative 20. Okay? We can put rules all around these things. And we can say, well, if you have 2 negatives and if you have a negative and a positive, and we will read these rules, you need to just stop, think logically, pause for a moment. Maybe you need to visualize the number line. Maybe you need to I don't want you to use your toes because you don't have negative toes and negative fingers. You can add these numbers because that's really what we're doing here. We're saying these two are being added together, and that's what gave us 20, right? Because that would be 1 plus 9, carry the 1, and that would be 20. But because these both were negative, it's a greater negative. You really have to have your critical thinking hat on when you're looking at these things to understand that there's logic behind this. Math is incredibly logical. It is logical beyond, because everything has to work. You can go into elements of math that go beyond even our ability to think, but just taking this very elementary portion of math, when we look at this, we have to stop and say, does this make sense? Well, I have negative 11. So let's say I had negative 11, or I took out $11, or let's say it dropped 11 degrees. Okay, so we had a thermometer that was showing a certain temperature and it dropped 11 degrees, and then it dropped another 9 degrees. So they were both negatives. How many degrees did it drop in total? Oh, that's simple. It dropped 20 degrees. Now, drop is the negative portion of the words there. So you really have to look at things, separate the negative, but at the same time understand that it's a major part of this. And you have to look at it from a logical standpoint. And let's move on to the next one. For instance, we have 3 and negative 8. 3 plus negative 8. Well, I'm looking at two numbers here. One is quote unquote looks bigger, right? The 8 or the negative 8 seems to have a lot more weight. That was definitely not intended, that rhyme. But let's say that since we have a negative 8 and a positive 3, the answer here is going to be negative. The question is, well, the positive is going to offset the negative by 3, which means I would only have negative 5. Okay? So positive 3, negative 8 would be negative 5. Okay? I'm not going to go through all these problems because you could just simply apply this, again, your approach. When you get to number 7, it gets a little more complicated because we have to find the missing number in the equation. Okay, we have, for instance, 5 plus what number is going to equal to 0? Well, we already know that you can add the opposites and they will give you 0, so I know that that would be negative 5. And I can see it again in B where we have negative 2 is plus something is equal to 0. Well, what would that answer be? Positive 2. But now we're moving into negative 2 plus something is equal to negative 4. Well, I'm going from negative 2 and I'm going into more negative, right? We have a big box there and negative 4. So how can I get to 4 from negative 2 to negative 4? Well, I have to add another negative 2, right? If you use the number line, quite simple, my terrible number line, I was over here at 0, and I'm trying to get to negative 4. Well, I started with negative 2. That's our first number there, so I'm at negative 2. How many more do I have to go in positive or negative direction to get to negative 4? Well, I'd have to go negative 2 more. And that's why this is our answer, negative 2, right? Because we had to go another negative 2. Now, and you can take that approach until, again, you feel a little more comfortable with the pattern, how positives and negatives, which one has the greater weight. I don't want to say which one's bigger. The number itself could be bigger, the absolute value, another word you're going to learn. So you might say like negative 8 is actually smaller than positive 3, but so you got to be careful when you say that negative 8 is bigger. The number 8 is bigger. The impact of the negative is going to be more than the impact of the positive, meaning you end up with negative 5. Okay, so let's see. You pretty much have all the way down just a set of numbers that you're going to have to find, and it's good you can use your number line if it helps. And then number 8, the very last one, says to find the sum of the following numbers. Now, when you're doing that, I might suggest to you that if you use a number line, okay, to just get familiar, you be ready to bounce around a lot. Another thing you can do is to group the positives and negatives together. Sometimes that's easier. So let me jump into, let's say, G, right? Where we have 9 plus -2 plus +2 plus -8 plus -9. Well, in this case, actually, I would probably suggest to you that you group them a certain way. I could group these two together, right? +2 and -2 is going to give me 0. +9, I'm going to bring over here to the -9, and what's that going to give me? Well, that's going to be 0, right, also. So what am I left with? Well, I'm left with a -8. So the answer here would be -8, okay? So that would be the way to do that. What I would suggest is if the numbers do not cancel out so easily or they're not opposites. Let's give you an example of that. Oops, I'm sorry, I just moved everything in the way. Let's just change these numbers so they're not as easy. And let's say they have +3 and -7 and +5 and -4. Okay. Well, I'm saying plus negative. Now, it's very strange to write plus negative, and they're doing that. It's not very normal. In fact, if you were doing this on paper, this would create a lot of confusion. You almost have to put parentheses around these things. Now, they don't do it because they're doing it so perfectly typed in that you can see the difference. When you're writing, I really don't suggest that you just write things that way, particularly when you get into variables. But just to humor the author and to say, okay, I like the way you wrote this. It's very neat. Unless you write as neat as the author types, you could run into problems. But so we're adding positives and negatives here. So one of the things I might suggest to you is to just say, hey, why don't we add all the positives together, right? So there's my 9, and there's my 3, and there's my 5. I can add those together, right? And then I'm going to add my negatives together. I got -2. I'm sorry, I didn't cross these out. Got my -2 plus my -7 and plus my -4, right? Now, grouping things can help, and you're going to end up doing that anyway down the road when it comes to variables, because you're going to be allowed to add x and x and x together. You will not be able to add x and y together. So sometimes you may have to rewrite equations just to see it a lot clearer. Of course, you're going to end up doing it in your own head and not necessarily writing it over. But in this case, I'm just showing you can rewrite this because we know that 1 plus 2 plus 3 is the same as 3 plus 2 plus 1. As long as I'm adding, I can add them in any direction I want, right? So we're doing that here, and we have 9 plus 3, that's 12, and 12 plus 5 is 17. So I have 17. Now what do I have over here? Well, I have -2 and -7, which would be -9. -9 plus -4 is -13, right? So it might look something like this. And now instead of having all of these numbers all over the place and trying to go up and down, +2, +9, -2, +3, -7, you can group them, add them, and now you're left with, well, I have a big +17 and a little smaller -13, and when I add those two together, I know I'm going to have a positive, and the positive I can write plus. I don't necessarily have to, but the answer would be 4. Okay, so it all depends on you and how your mind works. I can't rewire your mind to look at things. Math has many facets and many angles by which to look at, and I hope I'm hitting the different facets. If you have any problems with it, then you might want to look at it from a different direction. You can always go to the number line. The number line will be your friend. The only problem is that that number line is going to have to get very long when you deal with bigger numbers. So you got to start getting comfortable without the number line. Okay, so that's the end of this lesson.